It is my tremendous pleasure to welcome Dr. Diana Hechavarria to our virtual summer school in entrepreneurship research. Today, she is joining as a professor at Babson College, transitioning from Texas Tech University, where she served as associate professor and director of the PhD program. She has a PhD in business administration from the University of Cincinnati here in the US. She is also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship. And the last time we talked about this journal, she mentioned how her goal is to take this journal to the next level during her editorship. And she is also chair of the teaching committee of the Entrepreneurship Division of Academy of Management. Diana, thank you for taking the time to visit with us today.
No, it is my pleasure to meet with you all.
Perfect. I'll start with the first question, Diana. I'll ask you a few questions and then we'll open it up to the participants. Our first question is, how did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? Sort of a background question. I'm assuming when you were 5 or 6, you didn't say, I want to be a business professor, entrepreneurship researcher.
Well, it's really weird because it kind of actually was like that, but it wasn't like that. I grew up in Miami, Florida, first generation child of immigrant parents. And my parents were the only ones in my friend group who had a 9-to-5 job. All my other friends' parents owned businesses. So I thought my parents were strange. So I would always complain to my parents, like, quit your job and start a business so we can have more vacation time like my friends do, or we can have a nicer car and a nicer house like my friends do, right? So I didn't really understand early on the dynamics associated with business creation and labor force participation, but I knew there was a difference because I saw it through my friend group. And a part of that is because a lot of my friends' parents were also immigrants. It was really hard for them to find jobs. My parents are just really fluent in English, so it was easier for them to find jobs. So I think that was my first kind of inclination, like, oh, there's something different about these people who start businesses. And then when I was in high school, I just had the privilege of going to a school where I had lots of faculty members that had their PhDs. And I started wondering, oh, what is this? Why are we calling you doctor and not Miss or Mrs. or Mr.? And they kind of explained to me what it was to attain your doctorate and be an educator. And they had done the traditional work at a university, get tenure, and then they retired and they came back to education to teach at the high school I was at. And that fascinated me because I was drawn to being an educator, but I thought, wow, high school seems really hard because these kids are really tough because I was one of them, right? So kind of that interest in understanding, why do some people want to start a business, and then realizing like I want to be an educator, kind of sparked this interest in me in high school, realizing I wanted to be a professor, but I didn't know a professor of what. So that was kind of like a different journey. And I say it was a lot of serendipity because on my track or my journey to get my PhD, when I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, I did a master's in liberal studies at Florida International University. And this program was really unique in that it let me find a phenomenon I wanted to study, and that's why I was studying entrepreneurship, but I didn't know where my academic home would be. And during that time, I joke it really was serendipity. I met Paul Reynolds, who was managing this large national entrepreneurship project in the United States, and I joke the rest was history because I was like, oh, I'm already studying this, and you have this project. I'm the perfect research associate for you. And he and his colleagues then convinced me that, you want to be a management professor, and here we have laid out the trajectory for you. So that's kind of how I found myself here.
And Diana, it is interesting you mentioned Paul Reynolds because we were talking about him in this VSSCR just a few minutes back. But here's something I never asked you before, even during our personal chit chat, is you said your parents were immigrants, but from where?
From Cuba.
From Cuba. Okay.
From Cuba.
So you got interested in nascent entrepreneurship research, I'm assuming, working with Paul Reynolds.
Mm-hmm.
What are your views about nascent entrepreneurship research, the progress it has made, the current state of research, and where it is going in the future?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I think we've made a lot of progress, right? Working for Paul, one of the things I realized was back in the 90s, and early 2000s, there was a question, can like we actually screen and identify these people? So we know people are out there actively trying to start a business, but how do we find them, right? Because most of the samples or the research at that time were convenience samples of people doing this activity. So it was kind of very daunting to put a research design together to be able to screen and track these people over time. So I think we've made tremendous progress in validating that it's possible to do this. And it's important to do this because there was research in the 70s by this famous economist named David Birch at MIT that argued or was the first to identify that small businesses create more net jobs on average in a year than like large Fortune 500 companies. And there's been some debate about this finding over time. So some people kind of find contrary evidence, some people find evidence to continue to support this claim, but it made the United States and other economies really interested in small businesses because they realized that small businesses are the lifeline of local economies in terms of job creation, right? So I'm in Lubbock, Texas right now. There are not a lot of Fortune 500 companies out here. It's a small kind of Main Street entrepreneurship that are really the heart and soul of the economy here. So that's why I think nascent entrepreneurship is important, because these new businesses are creating jobs for what I'd call like Main Street USA or Main Street whatever city and or province or state that you live in. So that's why I think it's important, because you're very likely going to engage with students who are going to start these kinds of businesses and make these jobs for your local communities. So I want to make sure I understand what are the roadblocks or what are the factors that can lead to increasing their success if they're trying to start a business. So this is why I think it's important. One of the challenges we have is it's costly to identify nascent entrepreneurs. So even though we know there's like a protocol and a way to like identify them, it costs a lot of money. From my experience in working on the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics, two, and seeing it for the first design, it's like about $1 million easily to do this kind of study and track these people for about 4 to 5 years. So, you know, if you come to your dean or you come to your research colleagues and you're like, we need $1 million, they're all gonna like faint, right? So it's really important to kind of identify maybe pilot programs you can do or work with partners if you're serious about this, and reaching out to like the NSF or other foundations to create a long-term protocol like the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, right? That can track these individuals on a consistent basis. So that's kind of, you know, one of the roadblocks that we face. And another issue is that when we screen for these people, we kind of screen for them at one point in time, but these people have been doing this across different points in time. And this is kind of like this weird idiosyncratic thing that's unique about the screening protocol that's been utilized for nascent entrepreneurship. When you identify these people, some person might have started yesterday, some person could have started 10 years ago, right? And those are very different kinds of startups, right? So you need to identify ways to maybe divide the sample or have screening items to understand the nature of the activity that they're doing, because not everybody contributes in the same way to like economic prosperity or like the vitality of different communities in Main Street USA, right? What I think are opportunities for us is like we've gotten more into this understanding that entrepreneurial action is really good. Before, I know when I was working in nascent entrepreneurship, we asked a lot about their motivations and why they felt they were doing what they're doing. But sometimes there's a disconnect between what they think they're doing and what they're actually doing. So we've learned more and more in nascent entrepreneurship research that tracking the actual actions or when they've done what they've done paints a better picture of what the actual contribution of the startup is to an economy and what the startup is about. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. I joke that when I did my dissertation, I was trying to do like temporality in entrepreneurship. And this was back in like 2013, and there really was no theory about this. So I was kind of like grasping at straws in like other domains. And it was really hard to get people to understand what I was arguing startup speed was back then. And I joked that I just needed Matthew Wood to write his paper in AMR a little bit earlier. And I joke that now is the time to kind of revisit this research, because now we have a language to talk about temporality, where almost, 10 years ago, we really didn't. And it was something kind of weird and new that I was talking about. And I don't consider myself a theoretician. I consider myself more quantitative and pragmatic. So I was really struggling to find the language to talk about what it was I was researching. And I was joking with Matthew Wood recently that thank goodness he's written this paper, because now I can bring my dissertation paper out again and start working on it, because he's given me a language to discuss some of this phenomenon about the trajectory of action. So I really think a fruitful avenue for research is looking at progress, because it's something we've talked about in nascent entrepreneurship research a lot. We have these individuals that get screened into the protocol, and I call them like the walking dead or the zombies. They do enough to be considered a nascent entrepreneur, but they never really do enough to be a business. So these are people that maybe are like gig economy or freelance entrepreneurs, or maybe even serious leisure entrepreneurs. They see this as a hobby, They have a full-time job, and they're kind of going to these farmers markets on the weekends, selling their jellies and jams, doing enough to actually be almost a business, but not quite a business. And that's something that not a lot of people realize. Most people are working full time while they're starting their business. So there's this kind of critical inflection point where they leave their full time work and they start working full time on the venture. And we don't know a lot about that still. So I think that's still like another fruitful avenue for research to understand what is it, like what's that epiphany moment for a nascent entrepreneur to quit their job and then focus full time on the venture.
So, Diana, it seems one of the things I'm hearing from you is that there is sort of the Silicon Valley glamorous entrepreneurship, but your interest is in sort of everyday entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
Is that the way you see sort of the importance of studying nascent entrepreneurship, or
Yeah,
do you
no,
want to study sort of the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk emerging? I mean, how do you see this?
Yeah, no, you actually hit the nail right on the head. Those are also important phenomenon to research, but that's not the phenomenon I'm particularly interested in. I'm interested in, my friends' parents starting a business, right? Why would they leave their job and start a business? What are like their drivers or motivators, and how can I help them accelerate their time from startup to new firm? Right? So how can I get them there more quickly, or what obstacles are they facing, particularly if you're like an underrepresented entrepreneur or a woman entrepreneur? How can I bring light factors that they face that maybe more traditional entrepreneurs, or what some people call conventional entrepreneurs, face during the startup process?
Wonderful. I'll ask you a couple more questions and then we'll go to the audience questions.
Sure.
You also review papers, and you are also the editor of a journal that has sort of come into prominence in a very short period of time. What do you look for in a paper as a reviewer and or as an editor? How do you decide if a paper has potential or not? I'm assuming every author who submits the paper thinks there is potential. How do you make that decision?
Well, this is a great question. So obviously, first I'm looking like, is there like a fatal flaw in like the research design? So we publish both theory and quantitative or empirical research, both quantitative and qualitative, IJGE. But we mostly get empirical papers. We don't get too many theoretical papers. In terms of empirical papers, I first look to identify if there's a fatal flaw in the research design. So that's kind of like the first red flag. If there's a fatal flaw, we generally provide feedback to the authors on how they can address this issue, and provide guidance for other outlets they can submit to. Then I'm looking for what is novel, right? A lot of the times emerging scholars or new scholars end up doing something that we already know in a different context, right? So I understand that contextualizing research is important, but if we've already found this link between these constructs, doing it again in another context isn't necessarily a contribution, right? So for me, I am looking for contributions to our area by identifying something novel between a relationship with constructs that we maybe didn't think about, or maybe finding boundary conditions for a theory that we didn't identify before, right? So it's really about how you're contributing back to our field and the theories that we utilize. Now, just not doing research. I say like it's the easiest way to get rejected is like, hey, we're studying this in Cuba. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But if you're finding the same thing we already found and you're studying this in Cuba, it's not really a contribution. Now, if we find that everything that we understand doesn't work in this context, now maybe contextualizing is important because we're showing that this theory does not hold in this context, and that might be a contribution. So what is it unique about this context that nothing works, right? So those are kind of the things I'm looking for to help move the paper along. And I also say English is not my first language, so I'm much more forgiving when it comes to like grammar and structure and flow, because I think those things can be coached through. So I always encourage newer scholars to think about our journal because we probably offer more R&R rounds and more premier journals like JBV and ETP, because we understand that scholars are emerging and they might need some extra guidance through that process. So that's something we really focus on at IJGE. We really want to be developmental. So I'll definitely, like the editorial team will definitely take more rounds helping kind of coach that structure and flow that you learn a little bit more over time that might be newer to you as an emerging scholar.
And Diana, English is not my first language either, or my native language. So I fully sort of agree with you. But I've also heard from editors that there is a certain point at which they sort of draw a line and
Yeah.
say, I can accept until about this, but below this.
Yeah.
So can you maybe shed a little light on that?
Yeah, so that's a really tough one. So I'll definitely recommend a copy editor. So if I see the authors aren't using the tools or the toolkits that are out there, and they're bringing me back kind of the same manuscript without making progressions, right? So I'll suggest like, hey, give me evidence that you made an outline and that you've worked with a copy editor. So I need to have some evidence that they're actually working on this. Generally, I'll say this, if after like 2 or 3 rounds with me and outside the review process, which is probably more than you would see at another journal, they can't kind of figure out that structure and flow, I will reject the paper at that point, right? But I try, at that point, I'm so vested because I think it's probably something novel that I'm really helping them get there. They wouldn't get that opportunity if it wasn't, if I didn't really believe there was a contribution in the paper.
Okay. And now I'm going to bring you back to your own research. Can you tell us about one nascent entrepreneurship paper that you are working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you collect the data? How did you find a research team?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, joking about going back to my dissertation, there's a dissertation paper that got shelved after getting great feedback, but kind of getting rejected about 10 years ago because there was no language for it, right? It revisits the argument of business planning in nascent entrepreneurship and whether it's important, if business planning is important at this phase or not. And we actually look at the timing of planning. So when you plan, does that make a difference? So it's not so much do you plan, it's when you plan from when you started. So how close from your first kind of, we call it conception in nascent entrepreneurship. So if you think about the biological model and women getting pregnant and they conceive and then they give birth, right? So if we take that same metaphor, basically the argumentation, it's not so much just doing formal planning. It's actually, there's diminishing returns over time. If you formally plan, it's better to do moderate levels of planning early on, kind of almost what we would consider like the business model canvas, or we joke like just like that napkin outline sketch to kind of give you it's actually using goal setting theory to kind of formalize some of your ideas to drive the behavior. So what ends up happening is if you don't plan early on, you're kind of scattered in what you're doing, and there's no pace to what you're doing over time. There are these big gaps between what entrepreneurs do. So it's almost like there's this acceleration and deceleration in what they're doing. But if they plan early on, there seems to be this consistent pace in what they do, and that helps them reach progress to reaching new firm status. Whereas if they plan too formally early on, they actually are the most likely to quit because they realize it's very hard, right? So there's also kind of this consistent pace, but it accelerates their quitting. So this is kind of the work we're doing right now. And I've been having some informal conversations with Matthew Wood about what do you think is going on? What other theories can we draw on to explain this? And we're using goal setting right now or in self-regulation theory to argue that the more formal you plan, it kind of scares yourself out of nascent entrepreneurship, and the moderate levels of planning don't scare themselves out and actually help them reach profitability, because they don't see all the potential pitfalls along the process. Whereas no planning is bad, right? So there are these diminishing returns over time, because what ends up happening is they're constantly changing course. And they probably don't really know what they're doing. So this is kind of the paper I'm revisiting right now. It's very ideation stage, because we're looking at the data and trying to refine our arguments. But that's a paper I'm really excited about, because I've had it shelved for a while, and I was like, oh, we finally have the language now. So I'm excited to revisit this paper. And there was a recent paper in JBV with some colleagues and myself that used this same language. So we think there's a wonderful opportunity to contribute to that ongoing conversation in JBV.
And I'm assuming as you're having these conversations with Matthew Wood, you're also figuring out your author team.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then how do you decide the journal where you're going to submit?
Well, this paper, this is an interesting story. Don't do this. Don't ever do what I'm going to tell you I just did. I had this paper at JBV, and it was second round R&R, and I got so frustrated with the reviewers that I told them, well, if I keep doing all this, this is like AMJ paper. So I pulled it and I said, no, thank you. I'm going to send this to AMJ. And then I just got busy and I never did it. So I'm going to resend it back to JBV to give them the right of first refusal and say, well, I did this silly thing 10 years ago. If you would reconsider the paper, here's the conversation that's currently emerging in this journal. I've been kind of informally talking to Matthew about potentially joining the author team. I would be like the lead author and empirical, kind of doing the empirical methodology, and Matthew would be assisting me with the theory, but we haven't quite gotten there. One of those co-authors that I like to have a kind of very formalized rough draft, and if I'm lead, then I would ask kind of like some co-authors. Particularly, I'm interested in working with Matthew because he had the paper in AMR that really talks about the different types of, conception, pace for like the timing of activities. And I would like to introduce a new variable, which he hasn't really, or new construct he isn't introduced, which links to the idea of progress, which is kind of, I was arguing with him that pace is the wrong word that he's used, and it's actually duration, which is like timing from start to end. But I don't want to make it more convoluted, the theory he has. So we're trying to identify new wording for like this progress variable. So it's kind of those interim steps between conception and pace, which is the end. Because I joke that that's kind of like, if you're a runner, if you think about pace, it's like, what's the average mile you're running? And that's kind of the new construct I want to introduce into his temporality framework to showcase that this is actually more important in predicting outcomes than we have previously, or successful outcomes than we've previously realized.
Wonderful, Diana. We have lots of people who are interested in asking questions, so I'm going to invite Irna to ask her question on camera. Irna?
So, hello, professor. Am I audible?
Hello.
Hi. So, I just have this question that what are your views on women or actors from global south or from underdeveloped countries who are engaging in these day-to-day act of survival, which are also termed as entrepreneurial act of survival? Like, for example, marginal activities these women are doing at homes, like embroidery or handicraft work. So I have this question that do you consider them as an entrepreneurs in the first place? And if yes, under which domain of entrepreneurship do they lie?
100%, they are entrepreneurs, and I consider them entrepreneurs. In fact, my master's thesis was on opportunity and necessity entrepreneurship, and this is an area that's still kind of near and dear to my heart. I actually have a working paper with some colleagues on what we would maybe consider necessity entrepreneurship in the global south right now. I definitely consider the activity entrepreneurship, and what I think is most important about understanding women or anyone who would be typified as a necessity entrepreneur, I think what they think about their activity is more important than us kind of classifying their activity, right? So somebody coming from an emerged economy or a more advanced economy might codify it as necessity, right? But do they believe it is necessity is more important to me, right? One of the things we've learned with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is that you can have somebody in the Global South who inherited 3 goats and they're making goat milk and selling it at a market. And they say that's an opportunity because they inherited 3 goats and they're very excited because they didn't have to use any resources over it, right? But we'll call that necessity. And I think that's a problem because we're self-imposing our own views on the activity. So I think we need a better language between opportunity and
these
necessity to understand what these actors are doing in terms of their agency. Because what happens is when you talk about necessity entrepreneurship, we have this idea that the person's agency is constrained, right? But they might not believe that, right? So I think that's more important because entrepreneurship is all about agencies. I think that's important for us to better understand phenomenon in different kind of contexts.
Okay. Thank you.
One-
But actually, these entrepreneurs are like totally opposite of what we have this perception of general entrepreneur, like white collar entrepreneur,
Irma-
Silicon Valley entrepreneur.
Irma, in the interest of time, let's move to the next question. And then if we have time, we'll
Okay.
come back to your question.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
Arabi, do you want to ask your question?
Professor. Hi, Professor. I'm Arabi and I'm doing my PhD related to social value as a growth process for small businesses. I always refer back to your paper, Taking Care of Businesses and blended value creation, always whenever writing and reading. So I'm looking into, like, I understand small businesses are in the early stage of doing social impact measurement and social value creation. I wanted to understand the perspective or maybe like a hint or technique that I could be looked into small businesses, how they can embed or adopt social value as a growth processes in their growth journey.
So how can businesses use social value creation for growth, basically?
Yes.
That's a tough question. But one of the things I've noticed, and this is just like anecdotal evidence from teaching cases to my students, the businesses that tend to grow that are using either social value or environmental value as like their driving mission tend to have disruptive innovations. Right, so that's just something I've noticed anecdotally, and so I don't quote me on this, but I think so. Disruptive innovation, if you're not familiar with the theory, basically comes in at the low end of the market, so it's a just good enough solution. So when you hear disruptive innovation, it's not like a radical innovation. It's kind of like a cheap, just good enough solution to address some issue that the mainstream market really isn't concerned with, but it's the low end consumer that wouldn't have been able to access that mainstream product or service that is generally concerned with. And I've noticed that the businesses that are sustainable businesses or social businesses that adopt these kind of product service mixes tend to have more growth potential. So I would kind of maybe take a look at Christensen's disruptive innovation theory, and I would look at maybe some HBR cases for like disruptive innovations and like sustainability and social entrepreneurship to kind of get some insights there, and that might be one path to explore.
Thank you so much.
And I have to admit, Diana, that sounded a very intriguing idea that has not been examined in the literature, right?
It has
People who
not.
have social motive but want to still grow and become big.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think there's some good potential there.
Mhm.
Harshita, do you want to ask?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor. I'm mostly interested in women entrepreneurship and mostly interested in understanding the factors, actors, governance, and reasons behind the emergence of this women entrepreneurship. Of course, the mindset of entrepreneurship definitely exists, probably, but to see a bunch of women entrepreneurship moving to the Silicon Valley culture, like you said, is kind of interesting. So, if I want to track down a process or a factors responsible for this, what would be the ideal way to do it? Like studying back the archives or newspapers? How do I go back to this top down approach? And if I do so, do you think I have two stories to say that, okay, these are the factors responsible for development of entrepreneurship culture in whole, And these are the different factors responsible for development of women entrepreneurship in whole. So
All right, so
is
just
it
to
a
make sure,
global study?
I understand, so you kind of, your assumption or your thesis is that there's two different kind of cultures for like women entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs, and how do they develop? Is that your question,
Yes,
or?
that is, yes, that is my question.
Yeah, so one thing, so if you're interested in this idea of like how does entrepreneurship discourse, right, develop around these different social categories, right? I would definitely look at maybe the media, right? So I would look at discourse, right? So discourse is like a stream of research about how media, very broadly defined, like newspaper, television, magazines, right? You can even look at like program websites or syllabuses from entrepreneurship classes, and they present the phenomenon in a certain language. And that language then imprints on people to understand where there might be alignment between their identity and that activity. There is a paper in JSVM with some colleagues, I think maybe like in 2018, where we kind of typify gender. We built off a similar model that was in IJGE that looked at gender and innovation. And we looked at gender and entrepreneurship, like outcomes, entrepreneurship discourse, and then I think it was like interactions. There's a whole rich stream in feminist theory that looks at discourse and how discourse influences this. So I would start looking there between gender identity and discourse, and how these different outlets that communicate to us as individuals. So TV, movies, newspapers, and maybe pick one domain, and you can do like archival analysis to understand how these identities emerge, or these profiles emerge.
Wonderful. Monica, I think you're next.
Sure. Thank you, Diana, also for joining us today and for sharing what your experience has been. You mentioned that you were able to study entrepreneurs and identify the difference between what they do and what they think they do. Could you share with us a little bit on how you identify the difference, analyze the difference, and then possibly share the difference with them?
Yeah, so a lot of this work goes back to my time working with the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics. One of the clearest things is when you look at when they say what their motivations are, right? So we can identify like if they want to be high growth, if they want to build a business their children can inherit, or if they're just, looking to build something small and manageable, right? So we can identify like this configuration of what they believe they're doing, right? And then you go back and look at to what they report they actually did, right? Did they file a patent? No, but then they're saying like, I want a business that transforms the world. And I'm like, well, that's gonna be very hard if you don't have any IP around what you're doing, right? Have they hired any employees, right? Have they opened a checking account? So it's like those very basic things that you would expect a business to do if they're actually serious about the activity. And this is why I talk about those individuals that are, I call them serious leisure entrepreneurs, because they do enough to, make money on the side, and probably it can help pay for a vacation for their family that they might have not been able to take, or, put some money in their child's like college fund, right? So they're making sufficient money for them to not disengage, but not sufficient to be really considered a business. And that's why I say kind of identifying what I call the actual entrepreneurial action steps. So the actual things that they actually are doing are better predictors of what the potential contribution is of that business to the economy than them saying like, I want to build a business my children can inherit, but they're really not, they're breaking even one month, but they're not breaking even the next. And it's consistently like that kind of back and forth, right? I hope that answers your question.
Now, Diana, you
Thank
may
you.
have noticed that all the people who asked you questions so far were women. Both you and I do gender research, so we want to make sure that everyone gets an equal chance. So I'm going to invite John to ask his question now.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so my question is, we read one of your papers today, which is on entrepreneurship hub, where you were talking of goals and entrepreneurship, self-efficacy, and the outcome on startup. So when I saw the three hypotheses I discovered, none of them were supported. I was wondering, how did you get it across to get it published? Did you receive any pushback from editors and reviewers, and how were you able to manage that?
Yeah, no. Back then I was I took a lot of classes in statistics. So like I actually am like graduate qualified to teach statistics. So I was getting a lot of pushback by reviewers for this paper that, this isn't a paper because there's no findings. I'm like, no, findings are findings, right? So I drew a lot on citing from the American Statistical Association papers, because even back when I was a doctoral student, the conversation was being had in that journal that, non-significant findings are worthy of being published. And that P.05 isn't like the end all be all, right? So I was very gracious to my reviewers, but I was also very strong in my sentiment and citing what I believed were premier journals in the statistics space to make my case, right? One of the things I was really blessed for as a master's student is I had this wonderful teacher in a writing class that completely changed my mindset about how I write papers and how I respond to reviewers. And the biggest thing I took away from her is like, never consider your literature review a literature review. She's like, you want to see it as a literature argument. So every paragraph is weaving a thread to the next sentence to make an argument to your hypotheses, right? And that happens even in your response letter to the reviewers. So using that mindset and a lot of grace to make sure I didn't upset my reviewers. And then I was lucky that I had a really sympathetic editor, right? So the editor kind of believed what I was kind of advancing, so that obviously helped. Now, if you have an associate editor that doesn't believe that or isn't a strong associate editor, it makes your case harder. So I think it was just kind of staying steadfast to my beliefs and making a good argument and having a sympathetic editor. So it's a little bit of, skill and a little bit of luck at the same time, because I've made other arguments similarly and it has gotten rejected, right? So, it's kind of just the luck of the draw if your AE also believes in these ideas.
Wonderful. Seema, you want to go next?
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you so much for this session. It's very rich and insightful for sure. My question is that now I'm working on my dissertation, and I'm studying or examining the impact of fear of failure on entrepreneurship intention in Egypt. So I was kind of wondering if this topic of research would be interesting to your journal, and your advice was not rejected like thousands of times before that. Thank you.
So just to paraphrase, because it broke up a little bit. So you're studying fear of failure in women in Egypt, correct?
Not women, general.
In general.
Yes. Yes. In Egypt, and I'm using the theory of planned behavior for that.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, this would be interesting for journals, or is it old research? I don't know. But while research, I found this was interesting in Europe, and has many researchers before that, but not in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so this is what I would say, this is a great question about context, right? So I think you're starting somewhere, but it needs a little bit more, some more nuance to make this, I think, like an interesting paper. We already know that fear of failure is one of those personal characteristics among nascent entrepreneurs that are most likely to affect whether they quit or not, right? And whether they engage. So if I'm scared of failing, there's just going to be less nascent entrepreneurship, less early stage entrepreneurship in the country. If I fear failure really high and I end up starting the process, as soon as I get negative feedback, I quit. So I think if you're considering this and using theory of planned behavior, what other theory maybe can you integrate with theory of planned behavior that has not been utilized before, right? So what two theories can you integrate to maybe identify a new construct that might mediate or moderate the relationship between fear of failure and your dependent variable, right? So that might be one way to tackle this that adds a little bit more novelty and nuance to the story than something that we've seen, because I think lots of times just because, so we haven't studied it in this context, but what is it special about this context that's going to make it different, the relationship different from what we already know?
Wonderful, Diana. From Egypt, we now move to Albania.
Hello. Thank you, Diana, for your presentation. My question is there a common challenge that nascent entrepreneurs face when starting a new business? And is somehow the general economy of the state, of the country, influence these challenges as well? For example, less developed countries and more developed ones.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great question. So one thing, no matter what country stage of development, that influences them all, that they say is a problem, is time. They're always saying that they never have enough time to work on their business, work full time, and manage their whatever life responsibilities are. So I say that time is the most underexplored resource among nascent entrepreneurs, and that's why I'm interested in the temporality of the process and how these nascent entrepreneurs manage their time, particularly because most of them are working full time while they're starting their business. Now, of course, different stages of economic development are going to create different, opportunities and roadblocks for these nascent entrepreneurs, right? You might encounter more support in advanced economies from like what we call like entrepreneurial support organizations. So these are just like organizations that the government puts together, or other nonprofits, or even universities. Most universities in the United States have an entrepreneurship center that you can just go to if you're a nascent entrepreneur and ask for help, right? So that might not be a resource that's as readily available for entrepreneurs in maybe more emerging economies or more unstable economies. I'm working with some colleagues now looking at nascent entrepreneurship in war contexts, right? Because entrepreneurship still happens if there's war, right? So these kinds of resources aren't available and makes the venturing activity more informal, right? So that's another aspect of it that might be more challenging. You might have more formal entrepreneurship in more advanced economies and more informal entrepreneurship in not as advanced economies. And that creates different kind of, what I would say, constraints for the entrepreneurs, because it's harder to hire and fire people and grow the business if you're informal versus if you're formal.
And informal entrepreneurship is a fertile area of
Yeah.
inquiry in its own right as well, which needs much more work than has been done.
Yes, indeed.
Vetri, you want to go next?
Sure, Professor. Thank you, Professor, for sharing your journey and your views on the various questions asked. Your point about the finding a balance between formally planning business and then kind of effectuating really resonates with me. Maybe people who have a concrete or a full-blown plan aren't flexible enough and or do not effectuate enough. Probably that's why they quit. So is this the same way we need to think about our research projects as researchers, right? Do we need to find a balance between having not having everything on the plate before we start a project? So have what methodology we are going to use, where we are going to get the data, of course, having the ethics of research in mind, but finding a balance between not having everything and at the same time having something interesting that you have in your mind to research on.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
a great question. I guess, it's interesting because for me, I think I knew I wanted to study nascent entrepreneurship when I started my career, but some people said that that was too broad, right? That I needed to be more specialized. So I definitely, this question resonates with me because I feel like I've taken a very effectual approach to the development of my research stream, because broadly my tent is nascent entrepreneurship, but then I have like 2 substreams under that, because I realized that studying nascent entrepreneurship, men are more likely to start a business than women. I'm like, but why is this? And then when I started studying women, I realized that they tended to have more social motives. And I was like, why is this? So I think very much I took that effectual route and I let my research stream emerge just by doing research. And I never had a concrete plan, right? So I think but when it comes to the actual execution of the paper itself, I do think a concrete plan is useful. But also being open to feedback from your peers through friendly reviews to maybe modify that plan. You want to kind of have an idea where you're going to get your data, because that's going to make it hard. So you might have this wonderful idea, but you can never access data to test that idea. That makes it harder, right? So I think thinking broadly about your career, being able to be flexible to kind of pursue interests that might emerge through what you study is important, but then also kind of, that's like thinking about the forest. But when you have the tree in front of you, you want to have a plan on how to cut down that tree if you need to cut it down. So a little bit of both, I think, is important.
Wonderful. And Ashley, I believe you are next.
Yes, thank you, Diana. I had a question about segregated clubs and organizations for women entrepreneurs. So I'm working on a study right now and just presenting it in a couple conferences. I've gotten some pushback about whether or not these types of programs are really that effective for women, or if they have unintended consequences. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, this is a hot topic too that I've seen recently kind of discussed, and I'm kind of biased because I'm a member of Junior League, which is like an all women's organization for like professional development and community service. So I see value in those organizations because they do help with professional development. And then the argument is, part of the issue that women face is that, if we know homophily is a factor, that birds of a feather tend to flock together, right? So when we were like 13 and you go to the high school dance, like the boys would be on this end and the girls would be on this end. So these organizations are argued to kind of reinforce those network ties, or trying to creating more homophily. And what is needed is more heterogeneity in network ties, right? So I think that's the pushback that you're getting. Is that kind of like the main criticism that you're getting from colleagues around, like, why are we studying this context?
Yes, so they kind of question whether, well, I think there might be some evidence that these are actually not helping women, that, like you're saying, they actually isolate them away from those who can help them, especially in a context like entrepreneurship, which is more male. So I think that's where some of the feedback is coming
So
from.
I think if you continue down this line, you have to show what's different from these groups that they're not getting in other entrepreneurial support organizations, right?
Okay.
So like, why are
Yeah.
we already know women have this tendency to seek more mentorship and more professional development opportunities on average than men. So not all, I'm not saying that all men do this, but on average, if you ask them, women tend to gravitate more to these kind of type ESO for support. So what is it that they're getting there that they're not getting through their kind of regular day-to-day business transactions? And that might be an interesting way to kind of flip the argumentation. So it's saying like, no, it's not necessarily about the network. They're getting something here that they can't get somewhere else that's important for like their own self-actualization or whatnot, right?
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you.
Tanya, I believe you're next.
Thank you, Professor. So my question is slightly in line with what Mr. Vetri asked. So I've just completed my first year of PhD. So I've heard many editors say that incremental contributions to research don't count as much, and big questions are what the editors are looking for. So in the search for harder questions, the trade-off many a time is imperfect design, or say methodology or theoretical base, because like you also experienced, we do not have the language to deal with it. So as a young researcher, should we take on the easier bandwagon, or should we still stick to the harder questions?
Great question. I think you might want to have two projects simultaneously that do both. So you have one that might be more incremental and one that might be more big question, right? And you want to work on them simultaneously to kind of increase your odds of success, right? Not every project is going to make it into a journal. That's just the reality of it. But it's also part of your tenacity with continuing with those projects. So I would say the reality is you can have an incremental contribution. Part of it, something the longer I've realized as I've done this, is like the story is so important behind the incremental contribution. So if it's an incremental contribution, but you have a compelling story, you're gonna have more buy-in from your reviewers and your editor. If you have a boring story, it's an easy way to get rejected. If it's kind of like, oh, duh, right? So it's kind of a story that maybe they hadn't even thought of for explaining the previously unexplained variance in this construct, right? That you're now introducing. So I think if you do that incremental part, you will increase your odds. And then the compelling or the big question idea is always going to have the compelling story because it's the big question, right? So it's making sure, even though it's incremental, that there is a compelling story behind that incremental moving forward of knowledge.
And I think, Diana, what you said, which is, don't put, I mean, you didn't use these words, but what you meant is don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, exactly.
And, something we all learn in elementary school, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Ty, you're next.
Hi, Diana. So my question is, because we know what nascent entrepreneurs are, and we know who the entrepreneur kind of is, but when do they stop becoming an entrepreneur, or when does entrepreneurship end?
Yeah, that's a great question.
One tiny bit. So when they failed, are they still entrepreneurs? But the more interesting one is when they're successful. Is it because they gain legitimacy, or when they get success, or where's the cutoff point?
Yeah, I would say I have a more militant view than some of my colleagues about when entrepreneurship ends. So for me, like, because I study nascent entrepreneurship, I'm concerned with the marshaling of resources, the bringing of a team together to create the new firm. I personally believe once a new firm is created, you are a manager and you are managing the new firm, right? But that I'm very outlier in that view, right? I think there's much more flexibility and fluidity among our colleagues on this view, because we even have construct like entrepreneurial mindset, and it's argued that managers can have an entrepreneurial mindset. I would say I'm the outlier, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I'd be like, yeah, okay, but if they're not marshaling resources, getting a team together, trying to get investment, they're not really entrepreneurs, right? So I think when we talk about like serial entrepreneurs, these are people who have started multiple businesses, right? And once you transition it into management, you're just a growth manager, right? Because if you're growing the business, I might argue you might still be doing some of the entrepreneurial tasks, because that's a very specific type of management that you need to oversee. But I am not the norm. I think in our field, there's much more fluidity, and you would probably get a very vibrant debate among different groups of us if you put us together to talk about this. There's a recent protocol that's out of National Opinion Research Center right now called Entrepreneurship in the Population, that's actually looking at some of these things you brought up. So they're looking at people called withdrawn entrepreneurs. So they're people that thought about entrepreneurship but didn't do it. So we get to understand a little bit more about why they didn't do it. We have people who were entrepreneurs and quit. So they either sold the business or they completely quit. So we can look at those factors. We have nascent entrepreneurs in there. We have early stage entrepreneurs, and we have owner managers in there too, right? So you kind of get to see what I call the various steps of the entrepreneurial journey. I think this is a fruitful avenue also for research. So you get to understand that entrepreneurship is like a process that happens over time, and you can get kind of different understandings at different stages of that process for what might be factors that affect people entering or exiting the process.
Thank you.
Perfect. Ritu, you're next.
Hi,
Hi, Diana. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful insights. So my question is directed more towards gender and entrepreneurship. So I study publicly listed family firms in the US. And one of the things that interests me is studying the impact or the influence of women in these family firms on entrepreneurship. So one of the arguments that, like is tickling my mind is that these women in family firms, whether they're part of business families or not, could be, like in powerful positions such as on the board of directors or, like executive team. But then do they actually have the same say or the influence as their male counterparts when it comes to making like important strategic decisions such as entrepreneurship, right? Whether to like invest or innovate in certain products. And what I'm struggling with is like how I mean, I'm not that well versed in gender literature. So what I'm struggling with is to find a theory from the gender literature to ground this argument in, or to even see if this argument holds some weight. And the second thing that I'm struggling with is also, like how would I actually measure the influence? Because I'm dealing with secondary data. It's not like I'll have the opportunity to go ask these women.
And you said this is in the so gender in the family business context, you said?
Yes, yes.
Publicly traded family firms.
Publicly traded family firms. So there's an added level here, which deals with family ties. So this can kind of compound situations here.
But I'm willing, I'm not only, I would also look at women who are also not family. Yes, there would be, like obviously being part of the family gives you more influence, but then my argument is like, like something makes me think that do the women who even belong to family have even lesser influence than their male counterparts who are not family?
Yeah. So one way to look at gender and family ties is I would look at Goffman and his deference and demeanor framework. And it's more, so the hard thing is it's going to be archival data. So, and I face this, so I empathize, right? Because you're using something that's like interactional sometimes with archival data. So the thing you need to start like ideating is like, is there any additional complementary data that you can measure and match with the data that you have? If there are like, for instance, are there any like, when they do earnings calls to see if like there's any interactions on the earnings calls between these people, and you can like measure how they interact with each other or talk to each other to kind of get some aspect of like deference and demeanor towards each other. This is the deference and demeanor framework has been used a few times in sociology to understand family businesses. I don't think it's been used enough in management theory. So I think there's a opportunity there to bring that framework in. And I would look at gender structure theory. Also a sociological theory, but it basically argues that gender is also interactional. So you can argue that you have two interactional, right, theories speaking to each other. One focused more on the family business side, and then one also on the gender side. And I think if you would be able, since they're publicly traded companies, these earnings calls are public information. They're out there, right? The transcripts are out there. If you can get like recordings of them, they're great. And then you can see how some of these like executives talk to each other. Are they interrupting each other? Are they being gracious with each other? And then that can give you a sign to some of the arguments or the constructs that you're trying to capture.
And Diana, there is a stream of research on earnings call, especially in the accounting literature.
Yeah.
They've used even the volume of speaking as one measure. But I think Shikha is next.
It was fascinating listening to you, Diana, and more so because there's this question that has been going on in my mind for quite some time. So my thesis is on family firms, but I came across this venture started by 3 people. They have just started it, and they've not formalized, their products are not in the market yet. But it's so interesting to see their decisions every day. And it's almost emergent. So they make a decision today, and then it kind of changes. So it takes, so what got me interesting was, we talked about planning, how you need to plan, and how this planning can influence the success or failure of your business. But when these people, they planned in the initial phases, but then this planning structure changes, and the change you see is in 2 days or 3 days. So what I was interested in looking at, we've talked about when they are doing what they are doing, how they are doing. So is there any way in which we can, I can capture it right now, because I'm new to this literature and I do not have a research question, so to say, but this moment will get lost if I come back to it later.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions in that?
So for the context that you're studying, are you doing like empirical, like are you doing quantitative or qualitative research right now?
Right now, I'm doing a qualitative research for my thesis.
Yeah, so I would I'd go back to like strategy research on like emergent versus deliberate strategy, right? And then really try to understand and your data and how you can create some semi-structured interviews to identify how, without telling them that obviously you're trying to elicit this information from them, how these family businesses are thinking about the future of the business, right? Because it might be, if they're thinking about the far future, they might have more deliberate strategy. If they're thinking about short term, like tomorrow, it might be more emergent because they're not thinking about the far future, right? So this goes back to my idea of being interested in time and temporality and how we think about the future of our businesses and how that influences what we're doing today, right? So there's lots of work on subjective time in organizational behavior. I'd maybe take a look at that to understand how people do what they do, because if they're only thinking about tomorrow, I bet you they're more emergent. But if they're thinking about 5 years from now and maybe building a business my family can inherit, they might be more deliberate, right? So I would try to understand subjectively how these people think about time, and that might influence what they do.
Diana, we asked for 1 hour of your time and we are past that. Are you willing to take more questions?
Of course, happy to take some more.
Perfect. Rudo, you want to go next?
I think you're on mute.
Rudo, we cannot hear you. Rudo, we are going to go to Joyce and we'll come back to you because I think there's a problem with your microphone. Joyce, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm very excited to be here and speaking to you. I'm a postdoc at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, and my question is about a paper I'm trying to develop, and it's basically the framing. The data set is on women entrepreneurs, micro, small business entrepreneurs, but it's like strategy. So I'm using mainstream theories like dynamic capabilities, resource-based view. So with the framing, I didn't want to frame it like a gender paper, but a mainstream paper. However, the data set is on women. How best can I make that argument that, okay, this is a mainstream paper on all entrepreneurs, but my data set is on female entrepreneurs?
Well, I would actually, here's an interesting story. There's this wonderful paper in Academy of Management Annals in 2013 by Brush and Jennings, which is kind of like the state of the field for women's entrepreneurship. And one of the big arguments for that paper is that research looking at women tends to like codify us as this monolithic class, right? So like all women do this, all women or whatever, because it's always comparing men and women. So I think there's an interesting opportunity to apply mainstream theories and say like, hey, I'm answering a call on women's entrepreneurship research to look at the heterogeneity among women, right? So yeah, it's a mainstream strategy paper, but it's also contributing to women's entrepreneurship because not all women are the same for whatever reason, that your paper is testing. So I think that would be one way to say like, yeah, this is a strategy paper, but it also can contribute to women's, strategic management or women's entrepreneurship or women's early stage business through this understanding.
Okay.
So there's a research call for more more research only looking at women. So I think
Oh.
that's the way you can answer that research call.
Do you mind giving a little detail about the call? Which call?
Yeah, well, it's not like a special issue call. It's just like a call in this
Oh,
paper
okay, in
saying that-
general.
yeah, in general, like we need more just women only samples because we are tired of comparing women to men.
Oh, I see. Thank you so much.
And Diana, I'm glad you mentioned the Jennings and Brush paper because I think that should be sort of required reading for anyone interested in gender research or anyone interested in sort of looking at women samples in entrepreneurship. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Thank you.
Kutsia, do you want to go next?
Yes, I would like to ask the question. Can you hear me?
You sure can.
Okay, thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask, what differences have you seen between men and women entrepreneurs with respect to handling the uncertainty that comes with entrepreneurship? Firstly, and then secondly, as we know that the coming era is that of digital entrepreneurship, especially based on artificial intelligence and so. So are you planning to change your trajectory from conventional to digital, or you're going to keep the same trajectory for the rest of your research work? Thank you.
Great question. The first one is so loaded. How do men and women deal with uncertainty differently? I'm not sure. I know there are papers out there that make claims that men and women are different in their risk preferences, which I don't necessarily, I don't completely buy that argument. There's a wonderful paper too in Organization. I think it's 2013. I don't remember the name of the first author. I remember this name of the second author, which is Ruth, which actually showed that nascent entrepreneurs are actually more risk averse than the general population, right? So that makes me wonder, how are they are they even worse of handling uncertainty than the general population too? So I don't know if there are differences between men and women. I think it's still out there. Like that's one of those research questions that we're not quite sure. And I would argue we need more research to kind of really delve into that.
Yeah, because there has been work done on basically the risk that comes with the uncertainty. And there has been a paper in which they say that women are more risk averse as compared to men, especially in emerging economies. Like, say, I'm from Pakistan, so I'm going to talk in terms of subcontinent, because making big financial decisions is a big risk. When you are investing money in a new business, men are more likely to take that risk as compared to women, especially in subcontinent. So in that context, what do you see? I mean, I think you can compare that with Western and more developed countries, with the emerging economies such as Pakistan and India.
Yeah, so I would go back to that. I don't think that's so much a gender effect than more like a cultural values influence there. So a lot of the what we call gender effects are just really like socialization and values that get imprinted on us as we develop through childhood to adulthood. So I think that has to do more with kind of like the cultural milieu or like the ideological and normative context that might shape kind of how these uncertainty profiles get channeled through gender, right? So that's where I would contend that effect is kind of arising from. And no, I don't think I'm going to go into like digital entrepreneurship or AI. I still believe people start businesses until the AI becomes a robot and it has its own consciousness. Like then I'm not going to get into that space, because I'm a big proponent that businesses are created by people and people start businesses. So that's why I'm interested in everyday entrepreneurship. And by the time that does happen, I'll probably be long dead. So
no, because I
Thanks,
started
Diana. Kutsia, we need to move ahead, but Srinidhi, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. So Diana, I was thinking, you were talking about how, you know, entrepreneurs, nascent entrepreneurs traveling from startup to venture creation is something that you're interested in. I was wondering if there is an established role of entrepreneurship education there, which might help the transition faster in that area.
Yeah. So one of the things I think we've learned from like research on entrepreneurship education is that helps accelerate that process is the construct of self-efficacy or like entrepreneurial self-efficacy. Basically, by taking courses in entrepreneurship, students believe more likely they can do it. So that helps them accelerate their time to an outcome. So if I think I can't do it, I start questioning myself and I just take longer, right? Where if I believe I can do it and I have the skills and ability, that it helps me get to an outcome more readily. But I don't think like the effect size was, I think there's a significant effect, but if I remember, like, I don't think the effect size is like, I think it's marginal at best. So it's not like something that's going to be a game changer. But I think that's one of the things I remember from the literature and education. But don't quote me, because that's not really like the space I'm in. But that's what I think we've found. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Vishal.
Mohammed, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure, Professor. Thanks a lot. I think I'm audible, Professor?
Yes, you are audible. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. It was great listening to you, Professor Diana. Well, of course, this might not be your research area, but still, as you talked about marshalling the resources and the nascent entrepreneurship, a question came to my mind. There are two logics, the causal logic and the effectual logic. So how do you see that effectual logic being applied in the family business regime? Because it's all about marshalling the resources and they have got already enough resources. So that's my question.
So how do I see effectual logic in the family business context for a startup?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would see it the same way that I would apply in a non-family business context. I think the only dynamic that is different is that you have kind of these hierarchy of family roles, which might constrain or incentivize other effectual logics to kind of come out, right? So basically, if I'm the CEO and I'm the daughter, and then my dad is my CFO, and my dad says I can't use money for something that I want to do as CEO, right? That can create like a tension, right? So it's I actually always go back to like family business and using Erwin Goffman's framework of like deference and demeanor, because you have these two kind of you have this 2x2 where I have to kind of give deference to like a family member based on their role, but then they need to give deference based to me on my business role. And if those aren't aligned, it can create a conflict, and that might hinder the application of the effectuation logic, right? So even though you know, like, this is what we got to do to kind of marshal these resources and put together whatnot, if somebody wants to pull their father role over their CFO role or whatnot, and the CEO is a daughter, that might create like a tension or a paradox. So actually, I think paradox theory would be really interesting to combine with effectuation theory in the family business context to talk about those tensions that might arise from differing roles.
Wonderful, Diana. As you can see, people want to continue asking questions, but I also need to look at time. So let me ask you this. Is it okay if people reach out to you on LinkedIn or email to ask questions?
100%. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to converse via LinkedIn or email and answer any questions you might have.
Perfect. So let me ask you the last question, which we ask all our speakers. What's one advice you would give to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Don't give up. This field can be really challenging. And I joke that I was lucky that I was delusional in my ability. I thought I was the best, and no matter what reviewers said about how horrible my paper was, I believed in myself, right? So I think it's really important to understand, to be open to feedback and to be coachable, but also to have a very kind of strong belief and a lot of tenacity, because this is a very challenging field. And the most important thing at the end of the day is that you need to believe in your own abilities, and you need to be your biggest kind of champion. as you endeavor through this journey, because this is not a field for the faint of heart, right? So you need to believe in yourself and also create a group of people who are your champions too, that can celebrate your wins with you and be there for you when you get those rejections to help bring you back up, right? So that's something I looking back now, I didn't realize how tenacious I was. So I think that's really, really important as you start off on this career path.
Thank you, Diana. You were extremely generous with your time and very patient with answering all the questions. I hope, and I'm sure the others will too, look forward to seeing you at another.
Yeah, and if you see me, and if you see me at a conference, come up to me, tell me you were here, say hello. Don't hesitate to introduce yourself. I would love to meet you in person. Thank you again for inviting me. It was an honor to speak with you all this morning.
Thanks, Diana.
Take care.